To understand how Spring Boot works under the hood, let's take a look at this annotation, Spring Boot application, the main annotation that we use in order to start a Spring application. So for example, in this case, let's go to this annotation and let's see what we have here. Here we have three important annotations. We have a Spring Boot configuration, we have enable auto configuration, and we have component scan. Let's go and one by one see that what each one of them means. So for example, in this case, the first one, right, Spring Boot configuration. It's just a configuration the same way that we have used earlier in our 4-hour Spring core. And the next one is the component scan. It's a scans for the components such as the component, service, repository, and so on. But the most important one is the key for the Spring Boot is the enable auto configuration annotation. So what it does, what enable auto configuration annotation does under the hood. So enable auto configuration is the trigger. It tells Spring Boot to look inside the Spring Factories file of a jar on the Spring path. So what's that mean? So it goes to the spring.factories file and looks for which beans it needs to configure. And for that, the auto configuration class is used. Auto configuration class, they are just the configuration classes, but they are conditional. Three main condition annotations that are used. The first one is that the conditional on class, conditional on property, and the conditional on missing bean. So what each one of them means. So it means that, for example, conditional on class, let's say data source.class, right? It means that the only configure this bean if the data source class is on the class path. Conditional on missing bean means that the only configure this bean if the user hasn't already defined their own. And the conditional on property means that the only create this bean if the specific property is set. So let's go take a look at for each one example by example. So let's go to our Spring application, and as we have said in our Spring Boot auto configure. So let's go to the meta-inf, and here in the Spring we can find the Spring Factories file that has been used before, but in the earlier version of the Spring. But now for the auto configuration, this file is used, auto configuration imports. If we go here, and also we have another auto configuration, right? We have auto configuration Spring Boot auto configure, and we have also Spring Boot. If we go to the actuator, and we can find exactly the same file, so we can find here exactly the same auto configuration file imports. But let's take a look at the main one. When the Spring starts, it looks at for all of the auto configuration files, right? It looks at the one that is in the main Spring Boot. So here we have added two. Here we have added two. Dependencies. One is the Spring Boot starter, which has auto configuration file, and also we have added here Spring Boot actuator, which is in its own have the auto configuration file. So here we have all the auto configuration file that needs to be auto configured when the Spring starts. But again, each one of them is the conditional. Either they are conditional on bean, conditional on the property, or conditional on the class. And in our application.properties, I have set the debug to true. Let's start our application and let's see that how our configuration beans are created. Let's start it and see. So let's go and see one by one, right? So for example, here our application starts, and when our application starts, it starts to create our configuration beans, right? So for example, AOP auto configuration is created, and why it's created? It's created because it has the condition on property that we have discussed earlier, right? It has this one. It has condition on property, which means that they only create this bean if the specific property is set. And the specific property in this case is that the Spring AOP auto is set to true. It's by default set to true. That's why AOP auto configuration is created. The next one is that the AOP auto configuration class proxying configuration, right? This one is also created because two conditions are met. The first condition is that the condition on missing class, the class was missing, and also that the condition on property, again by default, is set to true. That's why this bean has been created.